To really understand the changes in a person after gentamicin poisoning, we need to understand how we, as humans, function in an upright position. Understanding some of the details of how we maintain balance is the key to understanding a gentamicin victim's disability. Let's look at what senses are involved in maintaining balance. A three-legged stool will stand on practically any surface, rough, smooth, sloped, or rugged. The three legs of the stool can be thought of as being equivalent to the three senses used to maintain balance. The first sense is vision. We can usually tell by vision alone what is up and what is down. The second sense is called proprioception, or the sense of knowing where one's limbs are and at what angle the joints are bent. Our joints have nerve endings, as do the soles of our feet, that give information as to where a limb is and how weight is distributed on the feet. The third sense, the vestibular input, is less visible, but is critically important. Inside the ear is a tiny organ that can sense motion and gravity. That, with the nerves connecting this organ to the brain and the processing centers of the brain, compose what is called the vestibular system. Our three-legged stool can stand most anywhere. It can be pushed, it can be kicked, and it stays upright. What happens if we remove a leg? Like a human being without a vestibular system, a two-legged stool is inherently unstable. Without constant external support, it will simply fall over. So what is this vestibular system that plays such a vital role in balance? As we walk through life, our ability to stay upright without even consciously thinking about it is based on nerve impulses generated deep inside our ears. We are all familiar with the outer visible portion of the ear. The majority of the ear's components lie buried deep within the skull. Separating the outer ear from the inner ear is the tympanic membrane or eardrum. Sound waves strike the eardrum and cause it to vibrate. These vibrations are transmitted by small bones into the cochlea, where specialized cells convert the sounds to nerve impulses. These nerve impulses are carried to the brain. Adjacent to the cochlear apparatus is the vestibular apparatus, comprised of a vestibule and three semicircular canals. The vestibular apparatus senses motion and provides balance information for transmission to the brain. Let's look more closely at the vestibular apparatus. You will notice that there are three semicircular canals. These three canals correspond to the three planes or axes that make up three-dimensional space. Looking at the diagram of the woman, I can tilt my head forward and backward, rotating it about this axis. Because this canal lies roughly perpendicular to the axis marked Y in the diagram, it primarily senses forward and back rotation. Likewise, the canal marked green is roughly perpendicular to the axis marked Z and senses side-to-side motion of the head. Lastly, the canal marked red corresponds to rotation about the x-axis, like tilting the head from side to side. So how do these individual canals sense rotational motion? This is a diagram of the vestibular apparatus. You can see the three semicircular canals. These three semicircular canals are hollow and contain a fluid called endolymph. At their base, the three semicircular canals have an enlarged area where specialized hair cells detect motion of the fluid within each of the semicircular canals. Impulses generated by these specialized cells are transmitted via the nerves to the brain. Let's look at these special motion-sensing cells called hair cells. This is a cutaway diagram of a singular semicircular canal. It is akin to an inner tube filled with water, with special cells at the bottom that can sense any motion of the fluid within. The fluid is a watery fluid called endolymph. As the head turns, the semicircular canal laying perpendicular to that axis of rotation turns with it. The endolymph, not being directly attached to the wall of the canal, tends to stay stationary, and movement of the fluid within the canal is created. This movement pushes against the hair like growths projecting out of these special sensing cells, which are called hair cells. We can visualize this process by imagining a glass of water with a false eyelash glued within, sitting at a potter's wheel or a lazy Susan. When the glass is still, the eyelashes stick out straight, but as the glass is rotated or spun, the eyelash will bend to one side or the other depending on the direction of the rotation. This bending of the microscopic hairs is sensed by the hair cells, and a nerve impulse is sent to the brain telling the brain which direction and how much the hairs are being bent. Let's look at an example of how this works. Here again is the cutaway diagram of a single semicircular canal. The bottom is a representation of hair cells. In reality, there are thousands and thousands of these cells in each semicircular canal. This is a representation of the nerves that connect the hair cells to the brain. At rest, the hair cells do not generate impulses, and no impulses are transmitted to the brain. However, when the head moves, the cell's hairs are bent, and a signal is sent to the brain. When the head stops turning, the fluid stops moving, and the hair cells straighten. The signal stops. As the head turns the other way, the hair cells are pushed in the opposite direction, and that information is sent to the brain. Any head movement can be picked up by one or more of the semicircular canals. By this mechanism, the brain is always aware of head movement, which translates into the brain always being aware of body movement. So what would happen if there were no hair cells? If there were no hair cells, or if the hair cells are destroyed, no balance information is sent to the brain. The person is totally reliant on vision and proprioception to sense where they are in three-dimensional space. They have become the equivalent of the two-legged stool. Let's see how this relates to real life. In this video, Michael has an intact vestibular system. He has his hair cells intact. Michael can walk across the street, talk on his cell phone, read street signs, and concentrate on everything but his balance. In his walk across the street, multitasking Michael never even thinks about how he is navigating his way. A month later, Michael received a long course of gentamicin. The gentamicin killed nearly all of his hair cells in his vestibular system. This is Michael a year later. Michael has to think about every step. Michael has great difficulty reading street signs. Danger lurks. For Michael, life is a series of near misses and accidents. So how did gentamicin kill Michael's hair cells, so vital to his well-being? Gentamicin is an antibiotic in a class of drugs called aminoglycosides. It is well known that gentamicin causes damage to the inner ear and kidneys if used for prolonged periods of time or at high dose levels. As gentamicin is given, the inner ear acts as a sort of sponge for the drug. The hair cells of the semicircular canals, which are bathed in a viscous fluid called endolymph, are very sensitive to gentamicin. The concentration of gentamicin in the endolymph lags behind the concentration of gentamicin in the blood. Irreversible vestibular cell death occurs after prolonged exposure or a high acute exposure of these hair cells to gentamicin. The resulting loss of the vestibular system leaves a person solely dependent on sight and feel to maintain balance, and leaves the person with oscillopsia, bouncing vision. This is a diagram of what it might look like if we looked at the wall of a semicircular canal through a microscope. This is only a diagrammatic representation. 3 hair cells are depicted. The blue portion is the cell body, which reacts to any movement of the attached hairs. The hairs and tops of the cells are bathed in endolymph. Nerve fibers transmit signals from each cell body to the brain. The hair cells are surrounded by supporting cells and a fibrous wall of the semicircular canal. The red line represents one of the many tiny blood capillaries that surround the semicircular canals. What follows is a graphic representation of how gentamicin gets into the endolymph and eventually can kill the hair cells. In subsequent slides, days into therapy are portrayed at the top. These numbers are representative of passing time only. Each individual case is different, and each person is different. This represents gentamicin being injected into the blood, as it flows through the blood vessels surrounding the semicircular canals. Gentamicin slowly diffuses into the wall of the canal. As the gentamicin continues to flow through the blood, more gentamicin diffuses inward towards the endolymph. Over time, more gentamicin accumulates in the endolymph and bathes the cells. Cells become less healthy. The hair cells become weaker. Eventually, all of the hair cells die. When human vestibular hair cells die, they never regenerate. Not only is balance affected by the loss of hair cells, but vision is drastically changed. A person with an intact vestibular system can look at a moving object and remain focused on the object, holding it clearly in their vision. Before gentamicin, Michael saw this. After he lost his hair cells, he lost the ability to track a moving object. This condition is called oscillopsia. A person with oscillopsia has a jittery and blurred world, except when their head remains perfectly still. Let's look at why this is. This diagram represents the vestibular system and the eyes. The eye motion is controlled by tiny muscles around the eye. In the brain are several centers which process the nerve inputs from the vestibular apparatus of the inner ear. In this diagram, it is represented by a yellow box. I can look at you, turn my head from side to side, and keep you in perfect focus. This is because my vestibular system is sensing my head movement and sending signals to the brain, which sends signals to the eye muscles to turn my eyes the opposite way. Without a functioning vestibular apparatus in the inner ear, there is no input to the brain processing centers to control the eye muscles to keep the eyes stable. Let's look at Michael before his gentamicin. He can dash across the street, reading a street sign with ease, still talking on his cell phone. Here's Michael after gentamicin. As he tentatively walks across the street, he has to stop, hold his head perfectly still, and wait until the street sign finally comes into focus. Imagine being condemned to a lifetime of blurry, jittery vision. Here's Michael before receiving gentamicin with his vestibular system intact. As he walks back to his office after lunch, his friend Joe passes him on the street. The greeting, the handshake. A year later, his vestibular hair cells gone forever, Michael walks to his old office to spend time with his former co-workers. He never could return to his job after the gentamicin. He again encounters Joe on the street. Joe is so blurry, and Michael is so involved with not falling, he doesn't even recognize his friend and walks right past him. Like so many things in Michael's life, the handshake never happens.